Well, let's see. I'm going to read today from Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, beginning with verse 29. And as you see from the palm leaf on the screen there, that is a clue that this is Palm Sunday. And the reason is, as we'll see in the text here, that the people, when Jesus came into Jerusalem, waved palm branches. And sometimes in church, people imitate that and get the palm branches and wave them around. But that's what happened in the story, and the significance is it's a preparation, or it leads to Easter, which is next week. Of course, Easter, which we'll talk about next week, has to do with the resurrection of Jesus. But in between, there can't be a resurrection unless there's a death, and so that's really what this is about today. Although it doesn't seem like it immediately on the surface. So let's just read about it, see what we can discover. It's in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, and beginning with verse 29, it says, "It came to pass, when he was come nigh to Bethphage and Bethany, at the mount called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying, Go ye into the village over against you, in which at your entering ye shall find a colt tied, whereon yet never man sat. Loose him, and bring him hither. And if any man ask you, Why do you loose him? Thus shall you say to him, Because the Lord hath need of him." Now I'm reading this from Luke's Gospel, but you can read it in the other Gospels as well. Matthew points out that this was done to fulfill a prophecy from Zechariah from chapter 9, verse 9. But I'm not going to turn there and read it, because it just basically says, Your king comes to you riding on a colt or on a donkey. It's a sign of peace. If a king comes riding in on a horse, a war horse, that's a sign of war. But he comes riding in on a little donkey or a colt, it says here. It's a symbol of peace. He's coming to them peaceably. So it's a fulfillment of a prophecy. So if anyone was thinking at the time about what the prophets had to say about it, they should have recognized that he's doing this in fulfillment of something prophesied by the prophet Zechariah. But let's go on reading. Verse 32 says, And they that were sent went their way, and found even as he had said unto them. And as they were loosing the colt, the owners thereof said unto him, Why loose ye the colt? And they said, The Lord hath need of him. And they brought him to Jesus, and they cast their garments on the colt, and set Jesus thereon. And as he went, they spread their clothes in the way. And when he was come nigh, even now to the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice, and to praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed be the King. Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Now this is now what they're shouting here and saying is a fulfillment of another prophecy. And I'm going to have Torin turn to this one. This is Psalm 118, verse 26. And I think it's interesting. There's something interesting to observe here. Psalm 118 saying, Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord. Oh, is this Luke? Okay. Torin, give me Psalm 118. I was going to say, hey, it reads just like it. Oh, give thanks. Let's see. Is that it? Did I give you the wrong? Oh, not one. Verse 26. That's how it starts. Blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord, for we have blessed you out of the house of the Lord. They're saying this. This is considered to be like a messianic prophecy. What I think is interesting in this verse, blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord, for we have blessed you out of the house of the Lord. The very next verse in the psalm says something quite different. Go ahead and give me the next verse in the psalm, Torin. God is the Lord, which hath showed us light. And then it says, bind the sacrifice with cords, even unto the horns of the altar. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a peculiar idea to stick in here. First, he's talking about blessed is the one that comes in the name of the Lord. And here they're shouting that as he rides into Jerusalem, quoting from this psalm. But if in the context of the psalm, the very next verse, David, you might kind of wonder what was in David's mind here. Now, David, of course, was a prophet. And the Psalms are considered to be, and Jesus considered them to be prophetic as well. The very next verse talks about a sacrifice. It says, bind the sacrifice with cords, even to the horns of the altar. Of course, that's what they did in the Old Testament when they sacrificed an animal. But the truth of the matter is, this is really important. The context here is that Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, and they're hailing him as a king here, but he's not going to be a king like other kings. He's not going to rule like other rulers. He is going to become a king through the avenue of offering himself as a sacrifice. Now, they didn't understand that. Jesus understood that. That's why he permitted all this to be done. And basically, we could say, set this up to happen. Anyone who was familiar with the Psalms would have perhaps read this next verse here as I did. Now let's go back to Luke here and see what happens. You see they're calling him king here. Verse 38, this is Luke 19, verse 38. Blessed be the king that cometh in the name of the Lord. See, riding into town on a little colt like this, this is how a king would come into town. Once he'd been, they're receiving him and accepting him, and he doesn't have to come in and, with arms and fight. So they're calling him king, which is really striking. Verse 39, some of the Pharisees from among the multitude said unto him, Master, rebuke thy disciples. And he answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out. He means the rocks, not the Rolling Stones. But and when he was come near, he beheld, and this is really important now too. You get the picture here, they're all rejoicing and they're hailing him as the king. And they're, Matthew tells us they're throwing palm branches in the path, and the Pharisees said, rebuke them, and he says, if they held their peace, the stones would cry out. And now in verse 41, it says, when he was come near, he beheld the city, and he wept over it. And here's why, verse 42, he said, if thou hadst known, even thou, he's talking to the city of Jerusalem, if thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. It's an interesting thing to say. In other words, he's suggesting that they don't really understand what's going on. Isn't that what's implied? He said, now they are hid from thine eyes. And then he says, this is really serious now in verse 43. He says, for the days shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee and compass thee round and keep thee in on every side. And this literally did happen. 40 years in the future, in 70 AD, the Romans came and did exactly what he's saying here. Verse 44, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. Now, he's saying, and not just implying, but saying directly, you don't know what's happening here. And I can only conclude from this, they're calling him king, and they're putting him on a little horse or a donkey, and throwing these palm branches in the path and waving them around and inhaling him in a sense. I can only conclude from this that they misunderstood what the plan of God was. They thought, evidently, that he was going to come in and there was going to be a big political revolution, and he was going to throw out the Romans, and he was going to be a ruler like all the other rulers in the world. But he was not going to do that, and that was never his intention. And that's, I would add, still not his intention. He doesn't rule that way. He doesn't rule out here in the physical human arena. He rules in here, in the hearts of men and women, in persons and people. He rules in the hearts of individuals. He doesn't rule by conquering with bombs and guns and weapons out here. He rules by what he's getting ready to do, sacrificing himself to create a new life on the inside. They didn't understand that. They wanted him to be a king like Herod or like Pilate or like the Roman emperor. But he had no intention of doing that. So he's saying here, you see, here's something you have to realize. The same people that are now shouting Hosanna and hail the King and all the things that they were shouting here, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Before the week is over, some of these same people are going to be standing outside Pilate's judgment hall saying, we have no king but Caesar, and crucify him. How can that be? Because he says here, you didn't understand the time of your visitation. This is a very serious thing he's saying to them. He came to offer himself as a sacrifice. They didn't know. They didn't understand. They rejected him because of that, because he didn't come the way they wanted him to come. He didn't do what they wanted him to do. Let's go on and finish this. Verse 45, he went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein. That's the first thing he did. That might have made a lot of people mad right there. He came into the temple and began to cast out those that sold and them that bought, saying, It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. And if you go on reading, and we don't have time to go and read the whole account of everything that happened in between this and when the scribes and the Pharisees, well, here, let's go on reading. I guess we'll read a little more. 47. And he taught daily in the temple, but the chief priests and the scribes and the chief of the people, these are the leaders, they sought to destroy him and could not find what they might do, for all the people were very attentive to hear him. Before the week is out, they will bring charges against him, and Judas will betray him, and they'll lead him to Pilate, to the judgment hall, and many of these same people, prompted by the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests, will shout, we have no king but Caesar, and away with him, and crucify him. Of course, number one, they didn't understand what God's plan was, but number two, God's plan took place anyway, even though they didn't understand it. And he was crucified, and that was God's plan. And he went to the cross, and he died on the cross, as we read about in all the Gospels tell the account of his death on the cross. Let me read it to you from John's, because I think John has something interesting to say. And that's what I want to talk about for the rest of this morning. John chapter 19 tells us, I'm going to begin reading Torrin with, hold on a second, if I can ever find it. John chapter 19 with verse 30. I'm just going to skip to we're not going to read the whole account of his crucifixion. This is the very end of it, verse 30. And when Jesus had received the vinegar, you see, he said, I thirst, and they gave him vinegar to drink. When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Now, it's interesting that he said this, it is finished. What I conclude, every time I read this, it makes me think of this. In his death, something got finished. In his death, something was accomplished. It was God's plan. It was God's purpose. And Jesus was well aware of it and cooperating with it, offered himself freely and willingly as a sacrifice. You remember what we read in the Psalms about the sacrifice. It's all connected with this. This is also taking place during the time of the Jewish Passover. Now, if you're acquainted with those kinds of things and the Jewish feasts and what have you, what we call Easter takes place at the time of the Jewish Passover. The Jewish Passover goes back to the story of Moses delivering the children of Israel out of their bondage in Egypt. And if you've ever seen the movie with Charlton Heston, The Ten Commandments, you see it all dramatized. And God sent all these plagues on Egypt, none of those did the trick, and Pharaoh never did let them go. But then the last thing that God did was he said, tell Moses, he told Moses, he said, tell the people that the firstborn throughout Egypt is going to die. And so what you need to do is take a lamb and kill the lamb sacrifice the lamb and take the blood of the lamb and put it over the doors of your house. And when the angel of death, the angel of judgment comes, when he sees the blood, he will pass over you. Now, it's not that that house got off the hook. It's that that house had already experienced a death. There had already been the judgment. In other words, the angel of death to come to execute judgment didn't need to come there because the judgment had already been executed, except that it was on the lamb instead. That's the point. And this takes place, John even tells us this, that this all takes place at the time of the Passover. And that's the reason all those people were in Jerusalem anyway. They were there for the feast of the Passover. Jesus came to fulfill the symbolism of what they were celebrating. Of course, he said, you didn't know. You didn't know the time of your visitation, but God knew. God knew all along. You know, way back there when he told Moses that, he had in mind the reality that would take place when Jesus hung on the cross and became the Lamb of God who shed his blood. And the result is, for everyone who believes in that, the angel of death or the judgment passes over. Because there's already, for us who believe in his death, there's already been the judgment. Now, I just put that into my own words, but the Apostle Paul, in writing in what we call the New Testament, and it is that for him, there wasn't any New Testament, he was just writing letters. This was his main message. This was his primary message. This was the message of the cross, and what it accomplished and what it finished was what he considered to be the primary, or perhaps the only legitimate message that he was supposed to be conveying. And I'd just like to take a few minutes and read you from one passage where he talks about that, because I want to be sure to emphasize this in your mind at this time of year when we're celebrating this. I'd like to read from Colossians chapter 1, beginning with verse 20. Now, there's lots of places I could read because Paul talks about this constantly. This was his primary message. The cross was his main the message that he delivered. He told the Corinthians, he said, when I was with you, I was determined to know nothing among you except for Jesus Christ and him crucified. That was the only thing he had to talk about. Evidently, there was something that was important about it. Something was accomplished. Jesus himself said, it is finished. Something was finished. Something was accomplished. Something got done. That doesn't need to be done over again because it got finished by Jesus. Paul tells it to us in plain, unambiguous language. First of all, in verse 20, he's talking to the Colossians here. I like this passage. This is my favorite place where he tells this. Colossians chapter 1, verse 20, he says, and having made peace through the blood of his cross. First thing Paul says is, Jesus made peace through the blood of his cross. It doesn't mean that he made peace between you and me or between governments or nations. He means that he made peace between heaven and earth, between God and man. Now, why was there a breakdown in the relationship? Why was there hostility before? Why did he need to make peace? He needed to make peace because there was an obstacle between God and man, and that was sin. Your mistakes, your errors, your sins. There was a blockage there between humanity, not just you, but everybody. And it's not that there were some who were guilty and there were some who were not guilty. Everybody is guilty. You know, Paul tells us elsewhere, like writing to the Romans, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. When God looked down at the world, he saw there's nobody that measures up. Everybody is under this cloud of sin. It goes all the way back to Adam. So he sent Jesus to just cure the problem for everybody. Not just a few lucky ones, for everybody, for you and me and everybody else. That's why Paul says here, just in general universal terms, having made peace through the blood of his cross. That tells me that when Jesus died on the cross and he said it is finished, the first thing that was finished is the accomplishment of making peace between heaven and earth. There's no more hostility. There's no more disruption. The skies are clear. Your sins have been removed. Let's not worry about the whole world for right now. Let's just think about you as an individual. All your mistakes, all your errors, all your faults, all your flaws. Let me say it this way. Anything that in your mind you might think disqualifies you from a relationship with God, He erased it 2,000 years ago. He made peace. He had you in mind. I think God's big enough to have all of us in mind. Don't you think He's that big?
Yes, He is.
He knows us as individuals. Not just us, but everybody. That's how big a God He is. He's omniscient. That means omniscient is a word that means omniscience. It means all knowledge. Instead of asking you to fix it, because you couldn't fix it, how could you fix it? He fixed it for you. He made peace between you and Him. And not just you, but the rest of the world as well. That's what it means when it said He made peace through the blood of His cross. And here, if you think I'm, making it too great, if you think I'm exaggerating, look at what he says next. By Him to reconcile all things to Himself. By Him, I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. Now, this is the King James translation. I honestly think he doesn't mean things like objects. He means people. I think that's what the point is here. I'm going to read it that way. Having made peace through the blood of His cross, by Him to reconcile all people to Himself. By Him, I say, whether they be people in earth or people in heaven. All things to Himself. In other words, He's saying, I'm going to reconcile heaven and earth. There's no more disconnection between heaven and earth. It's all brought into harmony again. Now He gets specific in verse 21. He says, and you. By that He means the reader. And you're the reader. You're reading along with me. So think about yourself now in this verse. And you that were sometime alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now hath He reconciled. What he's saying is that if you ever imagined in your mind that you were separated from God or alienated from God, I think it's interesting that he emphasizes that it's in your mind. Because of the pandemic, they stopped the volunteers from going out to the prison out here. And so I don't get to go out there and do the Sunday night church services anymore. But I remember when that was happening, I did that for years, really. And I'd go out there and Charlie and Janet, you've been with me, you remember what it was like. You have to go and, and sign in and go through a bunch of security and then you go out there and you walk across the yard to the place where the church service is. Then when it's over, you walk back again. And so not everybody goes to church, just the ones that want to go to church. And there's probably more that are out there on the yard just playing basketball or running around or just whatever. And so this has happened to me many times, what I'm about to say. Not just one time, but several times. I'll have the church service, and then I got to walk across this big concrete thing, back to go out again. And so many times, a man will come walking up to me while I'm walking out and say something like this: "I didn't come to church tonight." That's okay. You don't have to. He said, "I didn't come to church tonight because." Then he'll say, "I used to be a Christian." And I know he's going to say something happened, or he'll usually say something like, "I used to be a Christian, but I backslid, and so I didn't think I should come to church." Now, can I tell you something? That in the New Testament, you can read from cover to cover in the New Testament, you can never find anywhere that word. That's a church word, but it's not a Bible word. It's a church word because people think that if they get discouraged, or if something bad happens, or if they fail and they feel guilty, they think, they put this label on it called "I backslid." But there's no concept like that in the Bible. Now, see, Paul here says, if you're alienated in your mind, you see, that concept is just in your mind. In God's mind, it doesn't exist. God says, I've already made peace with you. And He knew about your mistakes ahead of time. He knew all your mistakes. He knew everything you'd ever do wrong. And He said, I've already taken care of that back there 2,000 years ago at the cross with Jesus. I was about to say, thank God for Jesus, Aren't you glad?
Yes.
He knew ahead of time. This is why Paul's so excited about this message. And you who were sometimes alienated, and by the way, I always tell those men whenever that happened, I always just tell them that. Well, you might have thought you backslid, but I've got news for you. Anywhere you slid, He slid with you. He said, I'll never leave you or forsake you. That's what he said. I heard a man say, oh, I shouldn't tell you this, never mind. There's a little bit well, okay, I'll tell you. Now I have to tell you, don't I? A man just blurted out one time, you can't tell me. When I said, God, wherever you slid, God slid with you. Wherever you thought you backslid, you thought you went away from God, but He went with you. He never gave up on you. Somebody replied to that and said, you can't tell me that if you go into a bar and sat down and God's going to come sit on the bar stool next to you. I said, oh, yes, I can. He's sitting there saying, are you done yet? He's sitting there saying, let me show you something better. He goes everywhere you go. He's with you. He never gives up. He never lets you go. That's what Jesus said. Once a person's with me, I hold on and I don't let go. You see, this idea of, we get this in our minds. Let me check that. In your mind. Yeah, I see that. In your mind by wicked works. What he's saying here is, it's possible to feel like you're alienated from God or separated from God, but it's all in your mind. Because Paul just got through saying, by the blood of His cross, He made peace between heaven and earth. He reconciled you to Himself. And He's already made peace. Now, the reason Paul's saying this, what you should ask yourself is, what's this doing in the Bible? Why did Paul feel the need to write this down? Because he wants you to know that you can have an idea in your mind that it might not be true. You can feel guilty. You can feel alienated. But God's got a better message for you, and Paul is conveying it to you. Listen to what he says. And you who were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works. I'm going to add a word here. By the consciousness of your wicked works. That makes you feel alienated. But you need to replace that with a consciousness of God's remedy for it. That comes after the comma. Yet now hath He reconciled. What you should say is, and we could all say this, everybody should be honest enough and humble enough to admit this. Yes, I've made mistakes. Yes, I've failed. Yes, I've committed sins and done things wrong. But, and here's the big important but the blood of Jesus has already taken all of that away. And so nothing separates me from God. I'm in His favor, not because I'm worthy, but because Jesus is worthy. That's the thought he's conveying here. Let me just read it one more time, just to get the thought across. And you that were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind, and I'm going to throw my word in here, by the consciousness of your wicked works, yet now hath He reconciled. He wants you to know that He's already reconciled you. Verse 22, in the body of His flesh. Notice it says His flesh. The judgment for your sin doesn't come on you, it came on Him. In the body of His flesh, through death. You see, He's the one that died. He's the one that offered Himself as a sacrifice. He's the one that hung on the cross and shed His blood. And in the process, the last thing He said, according to John, was, it is finished. Now, that's His death. In the body of His flesh, through His death, comma. Now He tells you the result of that. The result is to present you. He did it for you. To present you holy, unblameable, unreprovable in His sight. Well, you might be sitting there thinking, I could never consider myself holy, unblameable, and unreprovable. Well, then you need to see yourself the way He sees you. Because He sees you as the object of His work. You see, when Jesus died on the cross and shed His blood for sin, it was for your sin, and it was to do something about it. It wasn't to no effect. The effect was that it took it out of the picture. You know, the writer to the Hebrews, in Hebrews 9:26, it says that Jesus put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. That means He took it away and took it out of sight. I sometimes do this. I gather up these Bibles here, and if I put them down in the drawer, they're gone. You don't see them anymore. I put them away, right? As far as you're concerned, they're not here anymore because I put them away. That's what God did with your sin. He didn't just put it under the desk here. He put it away where it's never going to be found again. I'll tell you where He put it. He buried it in a tomb with the body of Jesus. And when Jesus came out of the tomb, and that's what we'll talk about next week, when He came out of the tomb, the sin stayed buried. God doesn't see it anymore. As far as He's concerned, it's all gone. And you're reconciled. And see, if you take everything that's wrong with you, everything that disqualifies you, everything that is a mistake or an error or a fault or a flaw, and even the root causes of those, if you take all those things out of you and take them away from you, then what's left? Someone who's been purified, someone who's been made right in the sight of God. As Paul here says, reconciled. You see, God sees you holy. These words that are used here, let me just get the grammar here. In the body of His flesh through death, comma, to present you. That means so that you, another translation says, so that you might stand in His presence. You know, to present you is Old English. This is the King James translation. This is the language that is used when someone is brought to the court of the king, and there'll be a herald that's standing there, and he'll say, presenting, Sir so-and-so, so you're presented to the king. That's the language, that you're brought into the presence of God, or presented, that Jesus is presenting you before the throne of God. That's why some translations say it this way, so that you might stand in His presence. Again, I ask myself, what's this doing in the Bible? Why did Paul go to the trouble to write this down? Because he wanted us to know it. He wants us to change the way we think about things. He wants us, see, as a Christian, you are one who says, yes, I believe in Jesus. I put my faith in what He did for me. I place my faith in that death that He experienced on the cross, where He took away my sins. What Paul is saying here is you need to see and account that death actually did something, that it was actually effective, that He has removed from you anything that would ever disqualify you or alienate you from God, and so that He says you now stand in His presence holy, unblameable. That means without any charges or accusations. Unreprovable. That's a similar word. That word just means that there's not even the possibility of charges or accusations. This is pretty remarkable if you ask me. He says, the result of Jesus' death on the cross for those of us who place our faith in that death is we stand in the presence of God holy because He's taken away everything that disqualified us, unreprovable, no charges or accusations because He's taken those away. And not only that, the impossibility of there even being charges or accusations. That's pretty powerful if you ask me. And no wonder Paul's so excited about this message. No wonder he wrote to the Romans and he said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God for salvation. When you present it this way, it's a pretty powerful thought, isn't it? Well, all I can say is thank God for Jesus, thank God for the plan of God, and I thank God for Him being willing to offer Himself as a sacrifice that way. But that's only half the story. There's a death and a resurrection that's part of the story of Easter. There can't be a resurrection without a death. And so next week we'll talk about why there had to be a resurrection and what that does for us. Because listen, everything He did, none of it was for Himself. It was all for you. It was all for me. It was all to fix for us what we couldn't fix for ourselves. To bring us into a relationship with God that we could never establish, that we could never achieve on our own. And I'm glad He did it. Well, let's all stand up today. I think we got something to be excited about.